May 7th, 1945. General George S. Patton walked into Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, with a proposal that would end their friendship. This wasn't just a meeting between Supreme Commander and subordinate. These two men had shared meals, families, and decades of military life. They had built careers together. When Eisenhower looked at Patton and said no, he wasn't just rejecting a plan. He was severing the bond with the only man who truly understood what it cost to win. Germany had surrendered hours earlier. American soldiers were celebrating in the streets. The war in Europe was over. Patton wasn't celebrating. He had come to tell Eisenhower they needed to keep fighting, not against Germany, against the Soviet Union. "We're going to have to fight them eventually," Patton said. "Let's do it now while our army is intact and we can win." Patton had a plan. In 10 days, he told Eisenhower, he could create enough border incidents to make it look like Soviet aggression. The United States would be at war with the Soviets, and it would look like their fault. Eisenhower stared at him. He had spent 3 years building an alliance with the Soviets to defeat Hitler. The American public loved Uncle Joe Stalin. The media portrayed the Red Army as heroic liberators. And here was Patton suggesting they immediately attack their ally. "George, you don't understand politics," Eisenhower said. "The war is over. We're going home." Patton saw it in Eisenhower's eyes, the acknowledgement, the understanding. Eisenhower knew he was right, but Eisenhower wasn't going to do anything about it. What followed over the next 7 months was one of the most bitter conflicts in American military history. Not fought with tanks or aircraft, fought with press conferences and private warnings and political pressure. Eisenhower would spend those months trying to silence the one general who saw the Soviet threat clearly. Patton would spend them refusing to shut up. The confrontation would cost Patton his command, his reputation, and possibly his life. But it would also reveal a fundamental truth about American leadership. Sometimes the general who's right gets silenced because being right is politically inconvenient. Patton's Third Army had driven deeper into Germany than any other Allied force. His advance units had reached Pilsen in Czechoslovakia. He had been ordered to halt there, prevented from liberating Prague. The Soviets would take Prague instead, and everywhere he went he encountered Soviet forces. What Patton saw terrified him. Soviet soldiers were looting German cities systematically. They were confiscating watches, boots, and anything valuable. They were shipping entire factory complexes back to Russia. His intelligence officers documented widespread atrocities against the civilian population. There were summary executions of those suspected of anti-communist sympathies, and entire populations were loaded onto trains bound for Soviet labor camps. Patton met with liberated American prisoners of war who had been held by the Soviets. These were American boys who had survived Nazi camps only to be stripped, beaten, and humiliated by the very allies who were supposed to be their brothers in arms. To Patton, every hour Eisenhower waited wasn't just a political choice. It was a betrayal of those boys. The reports kept coming through May and June. Soviet forces were installing puppet governments in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. They were arresting and executing resistance fighters who had spent years fighting the Nazis. Patton wrote to his wife, Beatrice, in April 1945. He told her the Russians gave him the impression of something to be feared in future world political reorganization. By early May, he had developed a detailed assessment. The Red Army had just lost 27 million people defeating Germany. Soviet forces in Eastern Europe were exhausted, overextended, and living off captured supplies. American forces were at peak strength. They had complete air superiority. Their supply lines were intact. "We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks," Patton told Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson. Patton believed May 1945 was the moment to act, and Eisenhower had just told him no. Eisenhower had military reasons for rejecting Patton's proposal. The American public wanted their sons home. Congress was already demanding rapid demobilization. Logistically, American forces were positioned to occupy Germany, not push east into Poland. But Eisenhower wasn't a cold politician. He was a man who had seen the casualty lists from D-Day and the Bulge. He was terrified that Patton's promised lightning campaign would instead ignite a 6-year massacre that the world simply could not survive. He chose a fragile, ugly peace over a righteous, bloody war. President Truman had just taken office and was continuing Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with Stalin. The Yalta Conference had established the framework for post-war Europe. The United Nations was being created to manage disputes between the superpowers. Proposing an attack on the Soviet Union would be political suicide. Eisenhower would be accused of warmongering, of risking World War III, of betraying the alliance. The media would destroy him. Washington would remove him from command. More personally, Eisenhower liked being the hero. He had just won the war in Europe. Newspapers called him the greatest military commander since Grant. He was being discussed as a potential presidential candidate. Why risk that reputation? Eisenhower also genuinely believed in the diplomatic solution. He thought Stalin could be negotiated with, that the Soviet Union would moderate once post-war tensions eased, that the United Nations could manage disputes between the superpowers. This was the fundamental difference between them. Eisenhower believed in institutions, diplomacy, and political process. Patton believed in military force and strategic opportunity. Eisenhower thought like a future president. Patton thought like a warrior. George sees the world as a battlefield, Eisenhower told his chief of staff. He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people after the war ends. Eisenhower made his decision in that May 7th meeting. Patton's proposal was rejected. American forces would not attack the Soviet Union. They would begin preparing for occupation duty and eventual demobilization. The conversation should have ended there. But Patton refused to accept the decision. And that's when Eisenhower's real problem began. Patton left Eisenhower's headquarters furious. He had just presented a military solution to the greatest threat facing the West, and he had been dismissed because of politics. In June 1945, Patton returned to the United States for a hero's welcome tour. He visited Boston, Denver, and Los Angeles. Crowds cheered. He was celebrated as the general who had won the war. But when he returned to Germany in July to govern Bavaria, the real confrontation with Eisenhower began. Patton started giving interviews to war correspondents in the occupation zone. He shared his intelligence assessments about Soviet occupation brutality. He described what he was seeing in the American sectors. He told reporters that American forces should maintain combat readiness, that demobilization should be delayed, that the Soviet Union represented a greater long-term threat than Germany had. The correspondents were skeptical. Stalin was America's ally. The Red Army had suffered enormous casualties, defeating Hitler. The American public saw the Soviets as heroic. Patton's comments seemed paranoid, reactionary, even warmongering, but he kept talking. In early July, he gave an interview to a military publication describing Soviet occupation tactics in Eastern Europe. He called them systematic brutality, designed to terrorize populations into submission. Eisenhower's staff started sending him copies of Patton's press interviews. They were becoming a problem. Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters in late July. The conversation was tense. "George, you need to stop talking to the press about the Soviets," Eisenhower said. Patton argued that someone needed to warn the American public. that Washington was making dangerous assumptions about Soviet intentions, that silence now would cost American lives later. Eisenhower cut him off. "This is official policy from Washington. You don't make policy, you execute it. Stop talking about the Soviets." Patton left that meeting knowing his commander had just given him a direct order to stay quiet. Within 2 weeks, he was giving more interviews. By August 1945, the gentleman's agreement between Patton and war correspondents was collapsing. Reporters who had once buried his outbursts out of respect were now filing dispatches about a rogue general openly questioning the alliance with Stalin. Stories began appearing in the New York Times and Washington Post detailing a growing rift in the high command over Soviet occupation policy. Conservative newspapers began running editorials supporting Patton's warnings. They argued that Roosevelt had been too trusting of Stalin at Yalta, that the United States needed to maintain military strength in Europe. Liberal newspapers attacked Patton as a warmonger. They accused him of trying to start World War III, of being unable to accept that the war was over. The coverage created exactly what Eisenhower had feared: a public debate about Soviet intentions that put pressure on the Truman administration to take a harder line. Truman's staff was furious. They were trying to maintain the wartime alliance with the Soviets. They needed Stalin's cooperation on establishing the United Nations and managing occupied Germany. Patton's public campaign was undermining American diplomacy. On August 15th, Eisenhower received a cable from the War Department. The message was clear. Patton needed to stop making public statements about Soviet policy. If he couldn't be controlled, he needed to be removed from command. Eisenhower called Patton again. This time the conversation was harsher. "You're creating a political crisis," Eisenhower told him. "You're putting me in an impossible position. If you don't stop talking about the Soviets, I will have no choice but to relieve you." Patton's response was defiant. "Someone needs to tell the truth about what's happening in Eastern Europe. If Washington won't listen, the American people deserve to know." Eisenhower hung up the phone and realized his problem wasn't going away. Patton wasn't going to stop. And that meant Eisenhower was going to have to make a choice between his best combat commander and his political future. August 1945 was the month Patton's defiance went from private grumbling to professional insubordination. He stopped playing the diplomat. In a series of tense meetings and off-the-record dinners with journalists, he told anyone who would listen that the United States was disarming in the face of a predatory tiger. He argued that rapid American demobilization was a catastrophic mistake. The point system was sending veterans home, while Soviet forces remained at full strength in Eastern Europe. Another reporter asked if Patton thought war with the Soviets was inevitable. Patton said he believed confrontation was coming. The only question was when and under what circumstances. Would it happen in 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years? He didn't know, but it would happen. And the United States needed to be ready. His off-the-record warnings were becoming on-the-record problems. Reporters were publishing his comments. Soviet diplomats were lodging protests with the State Department. Eisenhower's phone rang constantly. The War Department wanted Patton silenced. The State Department wanted him removed. Political advisors warned that the controversy was becoming a diplomatic crisis. On August 20th, Eisenhower sent Patton a written order. No more interviews about Soviet policy. No more public statements contradicting official U.S. positions. Patton read the order and filed it away. He stopped giving formal statements to the press, but he kept talking to reporters off the record. He kept sharing intelligence assessments. He kept pushing his case that the United States was making a catastrophic mistake about Soviet intentions. Eisenhower knew what was happening. His staff reported that Patton was still the source for newspaper stories about Soviet occupation brutality. The question was what to do about it. Eisenhower didn't want to fire the general who had helped win the war, but he couldn't let Patton continue undermining American foreign policy. By late August, Eisenhower had made his decision. Patton was going to have to go. He just needed the right moment and the right justification. On September 22, 1945, Patton gave a press conference in Bavaria that gave Eisenhower the excuse he needed. Reporters asked about denazification policies. Patton's answers were politically toxic. He suggested that removing all former Nazi Party members from administrative positions was impractical, that many had joined for career reasons, not ideology. The press conference made headlines. The controversy gave Eisenhower official justification for a decision he had already made. 6 days later, on September 28th, Eisenhower announced Patton was being relieved as commander of Third Army. The official reason was the denazification controversy. Everyone in the military understood the real reason. Patton had refused to stop warning about the Soviets. The 15th Army existed on paper. Its mission was to compile the official history of American operations in Europe. It had approximately 100 staff officers, no combat divisions, no tanks, no operational authority. Removing Patton from Third Army wasn't just a change in assignment. It was a professional execution. Taking the world's greatest cavalry commander and locking him in a room with historians and clerks was meant to break his spirit. They didn't just want him quiet. They wanted him irrelevant. Patton reported to his new headquarters in Bad Nauheim, Germany, in early October. His office was in a requisitioned German building. His staff consisted mostly of historians and clerks. His daily routine went from planning operations and moving armies to reviewing documents and approving historical reports. The press called it being sent to Siberia. Patton's friends in the military knew he had been silenced for speaking truth about the Soviets. His enemies were satisfied he had finally been removed from a position where he could cause political problems. But removing Patton from Third Army didn't stop him from trying to warn Washington. Throughout October and November 1945, Patton wrote letters to officials he knew in the War Department. He sent detailed intelligence reports about Soviet occupation tactics. He forwarded eyewitness accounts from American soldiers who had interacted with Soviet forces. He requested meetings with senior officials in Washington. He wanted to present his evidence in person, to make the case that the United States was making a catastrophic mistake about Soviet intentions. Most of his letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were polite but dismissive. Washington had no interest in confronting the Soviet Union. The American public wanted peace. Patton's warnings were politically impossible to act on. On December 6, 1945, Patton met with Secretary of War Robert Patterson during Patterson's visit to Germany. Patton presented his final assessment of the Soviet threat. He predicted the Soviets would maintain permanent occupation of Eastern Europe. They would spread communism through Western Europe, if not confronted. Military confrontation was inevitable. He repeated his grim prophecy to Patterson, that every day they waited was a day the Soviets grew stronger, that the window of opportunity was closing. Patterson listened politely, but he made clear the administration was committed to cooperation with the Soviets. Patton's warnings were diplomatically radioactive. No one would touch them. The meeting ended with Patton knowing he had been completely defeated, not by the Germans, by his own government's refusal to see the threat he saw clearly. 3 days later, everything changed. December 9, 1945. Patton's staff car was traveling on a road near Mannheim, Germany. The car was a 1938 Cadillac limousine. Patton sat in the back seat with his chief of staff. Patton was scheduled to leave Germany the next day, December 10th. He planned to return to the United States, resign from the Army, and take his case about the Soviet threat directly to the American people. He was going to take off the uniform, step onto American soil, and finally speak without a muzzle. The accident didn't just break his body. It stole his final chance to speak the truth to the American people. He was silenced on the very eve of his liberation. At 11:45 a.m., the Cadillac collided with a 2.5-ton GMC truck driven by Sergeant Robert L. Thompson at an intersection. The impact wasn't severe. The truck was moving slowly. The Cadillac's front end was damaged, but the passenger compartment was intact. Patton's chief of staff was shaken but uninjured. The driver had minor cuts, but Patton had been thrown forward violently. His head struck a metal partition or the roof. The impact caused severe damage to his cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was conscious. He could speak, but he couldn't move his arms or legs. The spinal injury was devastating. Patton was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. Military doctors examined him and understood immediately that his injuries were catastrophic. The news reached Eisenhower within hours. It reached Washington the same day. Within 24 hours, it was on newspaper front pages across America. Patton, critically injured in car accident, ran in every major paper. The stories described his condition as grave. Doctors said he might never walk again. The circumstances of the accident immediately fueled speculation. The timing was suspicious. 3 days after his meeting with Patterson, 3 days after his final attempt to warn Washington about the Soviets. The truck driver's explanation seemed implausible to some. He claimed he hadn't seen the staff car approaching the intersection despite clear sight lines. Conspiracy theories began circulating. Some suggested Soviet agents had arranged the accident. Others believed American intelligence had silenced the general, whose warnings had become a career-ending stance for anyone who listened. No credible evidence of sabotage was ever produced. Military investigators concluded it was a simple traffic accident. Bad luck and unfortunate timing. But the theories persisted because Patton's death would prove so convenient for those who wanted him silenced. Patton lay paralyzed in a hospital bed in Heidelberg for 12 days. He knew he was dying. He could feel his body failing. The paralysis was complete. He couldn't move anything below his neck. Pneumonia was developing in his lungs because he couldn't breathe deeply. His wife Beatrice flew from the United States to be with him. She arrived on December 11th. He told her he was ready to die. He had fought his last battle. Not against Germans, against his own government's refusal to see the Soviet threat. Eisenhower never made it to the bedside. He was thousands of miles away in Washington, caught in the very political machine Patton had tried to warn him about. He sent a telegram expressing his distress. He offered to send his own personal doctor. But the two men who had once been friends would never speak again. They parted as adversaries. A tragic end to a partnership that had saved the West. Throughout those 12 days, Patton remained lucid. He dictated letters. He spoke with visitors. He knew exactly what was happening to his body. On December 20th, his condition deteriorated sharply. The pneumonia was overwhelming his lungs. His heart was failing. At 5:55 p.m. on December 21st, 1945, General George S. Patton, Jr. died from complications of his injuries. He was 60 years old. The official cause of death was listed as pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure resulting from the spinal injury. Patton was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery on December 24th, 1945. He had requested to be buried among the soldiers of Third Army who had died in combat. He didn't ask for a monument in Washington. He asked to lie in the mud of Luxembourg with the men of the Third Army. He was finally back where he belonged. Not in the halls of power that had silenced him, but among the soldiers who had never doubted him. 6,000 graves surrounded his, young men who had followed him through France and Germany, who had died fighting the war he had helped win. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The general who had wanted to keep fighting to prevent Soviet expansion was buried while Soviet forces were consolidating control over Eastern Europe. Within 6 months, every prediction Patton had made began coming true. Soviet forces refused to leave Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Free elections promised at Yalta never happened. In Poland, the Soviets arrested resistance leaders who had fought the Nazis for 6 years. Thousands were executed or sent to labor camps. In Czechoslovakia, a 1948 communist coup overthrew the democratic government. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a suspicious fall ruled suicide. By 1946, Winston Churchill was using the phrase Patton had anticipated. An iron curtain has descended across Europe, Churchill told an American audience on March 5, 1946. Only 74 days after Patton's death. By 1947, the Truman administration had abandoned cooperation with the Soviets and adopted the policy of containment. George Kennan's analysis of Soviet intentions echoed warnings Patton had given 2 years earlier. By 1950, American soldiers were fighting communists in Korea. The confrontation Patton predicted had begun. The question Eisenhower never answered publicly was whether Patton had been right not just about the threat, but about the timing. Whether May 1945 had been the moment to act. Whether silencing Patton had cost the West its best chance to prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Eisenhower went on to become president. He managed the Cold War that Patton had wanted to prevent. He built the policy of containment that accepted Soviet control of half of Europe as permanent. Whether he ever regretted silencing Patton's warnings, no one knows. He never said. By the time American leadership accepted Patton had been right about Soviet intentions, millions in Eastern Europe were living under communist tyranny. The Iron Curtain, he predicted, had become concrete and barbed wire. Whether his proposed solution would have worked remains unknowable. But that he correctly identified the threat before American leaders would acknowledge it is undeniable. Eisenhower chose political safety over strategic risk. He silenced the warrior who saw clearly, because the warrior's message was a bridge too far for Washington. 45 years of Cold War. Millions dead under communist regimes. The permanent division of Europe until 1991. Patton's 15th Army history staff produced the theater manuals and small wars doctrine that would form the basis of early Cold War military strategy. It was the final irony. Even in silence, his influence remained. We remember Patton as a hothead, a man of blood and guts, but history proved him to be something else, a prophet. As the concrete of the Berlin Wall went up and the Iron Curtain fell, the silence of George Patton became the loudest tragedy of the 20th century. He died believing he had failed, but his only failure was seeing the truth before the world was ready to hear it.